How the Fairy Tale Began by Sarah Houlihan. Read by Paul Daly. Silence. All I could hear was the waves breaking on the unforgiving stones. The same stones sat in mute witness to my impending end. A light breeze lifted the hem of my cloak to float just behind me. I gripped the gilded edge of my sword so tightly my knuckles cracked and whitened. I cared little. The pain would be like a grain of sand in comparison to the agony that awaited me. The watching crowd bored holes in me with the focus of their gazes as I put one foot in front of the other with the hesitancy of a child taking its first steps. I raised my chin and saw my foe advance. It had all come down to this: to single combat on the foreshore, where the blood of the loser would be taken by the sea in some form of heathen payment. The famed warrior before me raised his weapon. In that moment I should have been planning some form of defence to save myself, but, try as I might, I couldn't. I was not thinking of any of it. In my mind I had returned to a day 9 years previously, a summer evening in my father's sumptuous palace. I had been presented with a friend, something I had not previously. She was smaller than me, but we dressed similarly, and spoke alike, so I was unperturbed by her delicacy, and the fact that she was a girl. We ran through the gardens for what seemed to be hours, and we stole apples from the castle orchard. As we sat down to enjoy the fruits of our crimes, Bevine said, quite out of context, "They want us to be married when we're big." Her dark hair tangled around her face, and she looked at me with the smug superiority of a child who knows something. "My father told me. He said I'd better like you because we'll be getting married when we're old enough to." Her father was a friend of mine. I could not grasp this idea. I was young, and I thought life would go on as it always had, devoid of hardships, days filled with joys and adventures, the only son of a strong ruler with no obligations. I was young, and a fool. The crowd were growing anxious. They had come to see blood, and this slow evaluation of the opponent did little to please them. Very few of them stood in my corner. Why would they? He was the pride of the land, their best warrior, the man every mother wants her son to grow up to be. Physically, he matched up with their ideals of a victor, tall and broad with heavily muscled shoulders and coal black eyes. I was nothing but a puny weed, pale and delicate in appearance, with my mother's honey blonde hair. The spectators knew how this would end. The distance between us had shortened to a sword's length. I could hear him breathing. "May mercy be shown on us here this day," he murmured through clenched teeth. I barely heard. I was somewhere else. It was the spring past, and I was ushered into the great hall to greet visitors. As I entered, the strangers rose and dropped into the respectful bows and curtsies that befitted my rank. All except one. A young woman with waves of dark hair regarded me disdainfully as the others rose again. My father spoke in that distinctive voice of his that signalled his authority. "Brian, you shall greet the Lady Bevine as your future queen and the mother of your heirs." I reeled backwards in shock, the words of my almost forgotten friend ringing sharply in my ears. It had been no lie, as I had persuaded myself in the preceding years. We had no choice in the matter. Our futures had been entwined from before we could walk. I pleaded with my father all day and most of the night, begged on my knees for him to see sense, to relent. He could not see through my eyes. or maybe it was easier for him to pretend so. In his mind, this was but a strategic alliance between two kingdoms. More than that, he had given his word. I felt like death was coming upon me prematurely, sick with fear, guilt, and sorrow. I had a strong and fervent belief in love, a kind of heart-freezing, illuminating, instantaneous love. My whole body cried out against the idea of a prearranged marriage like this. I could not fall in love with Bevin, and she had no love for me. I made my declaration as the two strong leaders sat together at table. I will not marry her, not now, not ever. Her father was apoplectic with rage, veins jumping in his neck and his eyes bulging as if they wanted to reach me and inflict his wrath upon me themselves. I had jilted his daughter and slighted his kingdom. He had no son, no other children except Bevin. I had been the key to the succession of his kingdom, a way for his grandchildren to retain their royal title. I had ruined all that he had strived for, a dynasty, but I would not partake. He sought to make me feel his anguish, and he had all the necessary tools to inflict the worst upon me. He had under his command a fearsome warrior, a man who had never been beaten in single combat despite having fought many times for the honour of his monarchy. I was to oppose him at dawn on Midsummer's Day. If I won, I could have my way and the arrangement would be void. But if I lost, my free will and my father's kingdom would be his. It seemed impossible. A raucous call from the crowd broke my reverie. He stood poised to strike like the cobra of the east, the muscles bulging in his arms. My sword felt as heavy as lead as I lifted it in a vain attempt to delay the inevitable. I saw an emotion in the depths of his eyes that I could put no name to, but that seemed blurrily familiar. It shook me to the core of my being because it reminded me of why I had objected to the obscene plan in the first place. He dropped the vicious sword and it clattered noisily between our feet. He fell to his knees and buried his face in spade-like hands. The crowd were roaring their confusion and disapproval as I stumbled backwards along the smooth stones, but I had a strengthening feeling that I was not the reason he had stopped. A blur of colour and ebony waves broke from the crowd and threw itself at the feet of the disgraced champion. Bevin wrapped her porcelain arms around him and shielded him from the angry crowd with her cloak. As he raised his head, he was a man transfigured with a wild and glorious happiness that immediately silenced everyone, and explained everything to me more completely than words ever could. That look I had seen in his eyes, it had been love. A love he would have sacrificed everything for without ever being sure of it being returned to him. But it was. Oh, from the very way she stood, I knew with certainty it was. She was floating like an angel. As they rose in one fluid movement, the old king stiffly nodded his approval, and concealed his tears behind surliness and his bushy greying beard. I watched this scene of perfect happiness for a moment. Then I turned sharply upon my heel and strode away, to search for my own version of this pure and conquering beauty, for my own happy ending, for my love.